So hi everyone, my name's Emily, and this is my colleague Priyanka. We're going to be presenting our project Cultivating Commons, designing public common partnerships to mobilize the bio-based construction industry in the East Midlands through an integrated landscape approach. So the UK is targeting net zero by 2050, and the construction industry constitutes 40% of the UK's total carbon emissions. So meeting these targets demands a radical transformation of the industry's current operations. And in response to the UK's target, 80 UK research and innovation institutes are seeking to retrofit their campuses. This project serves as a case study for the British Geological Survey campus in the East Midlands, who want to improve energy efficiency and interior conditions. In response to these needs, the BGS retained an architect to prepare a retrofitting proposal. And in reviewing the proposal, we acknowledged that there was little to no recognition for embodied carbon, which accounts for the extraction, processing, and disposal of materials. We know that extractive materials are fossil fuel intensive and have negative impacts to local communities and the environment. So in search of alternative retrofitting materials, we interrogated 6 different bio-based materials to understand their availability and the industries in the UK. From our analysis, we selected straw, seaweed, and shellfish for the retrofitting of the BGS. Straw because it's abundantly available in the UK and the industry is fairly well established. And then seaweed and shellfish, initially because of their carbon sequestration potential and the fact that seaweed is currently used as a fertilizer for agricultural lands, and with further R&D, it has the potential to be used as a construction material in the long term. So to procure these materials locally, we look to this case report that's already been completed by Material Cultures and Arup to understand how we could also devise a supply chain for procuring straw and seaweed locally for the BGS. And we envisioned through cartographic studies that straw could come from local surrounding farms, and that would be in the short term, and seaweed could be used as fertilizer on those farms. And then eventually, as the seaweed industry were to take off, there could be acoustic paneling provided through the material supply chain to the BGS. And we recognize through this mapping that this is just one potential network that could be created, but there are many. So we explored prototyping the BGS with straw insulation and then the seaweed acoustic paneling. And we also are proposing oyster shell rendering for the facades. But focusing just on net zero is very limiting, and it dismisses many critical factors associated with the climate crisis. So with this project, we're taking a position that net zero and carbon calculations actually keep us from addressing the climate crisis, and hence we're moving beyond to address landscapes, labor, and ownerships of where these materials are derived to mobilize bio-based industries. So there are many avenues to procure straw and seaweed for the retrofitting of the BGS. So for example, straw farmed in a monoculture way could be readily available. However, we know that these types of practices have negative impacts to the local environment and communities. So therefore, our approach considers equally the viability of these industries to local economies and the ecologies within the UK. Echoing the works of dark matter labs, if these resources flow through the existing governance structures, they could lead to further commodification, privatization, and centralization of natural assets and wealth. So we needed to look at alternative forms of governance and policy, and one of those is public common partnerships. And with this model, we hope that benefits from this supply chain and procurement of goods and services remain within the local communities.
Public common partnerships are an institutional form that democratizes the management and ownership of an asset or resource. We are envisioning that the BGS, through its procurement strategy, would mandate the use of bio-based materials agroecologically produced in the project brief. In response, the awarded designer consults with a PCP advisor and engages with the university researchers to form an East Midlands Bio-Based Commons Association. Through this partnership, the local council could provide underutilized lands and council farms to initiate material prototyping sites, engaging underskilled and underemployed community members. Each of these sites become testing grounds for activities like wall assemblies and farming methods, soil sampling, and to host educational events. Once the prototyping sites take off, we envision a phased approach that expands to the broader East Midlands bioregion, encouraging bio-based material production by existing land and marine workers. We have conducted a cartographic landscape analysis to understand the distribution of prototyping sites and farms in the bioregion. We have considered, by improving the ecological practices on these farms, we have considered how they integrate with existing farms and habitats within 10 kilometers from the phase 1 and 2 sites. The farms can then form a part of the network of productive landscapes to benefit the biodiversity on the farms and in the region at large. So basically it creates a strong network of production in the center around here, which was done through a cartographic analysis of the 10-kilometer buffers around these phase 1 and 2 sites. These agroecological principles could include growing perennial wheat tree buffers and livestock grazing to regenerate the soil, and further strengthen the connections at a multi-farm level through biodiverse recreation trails. Similarly, for the seaweed industry, onshore activities could include drying facilities, recreation trails, and small ports for monitoring and maintenance. Furthermore, shellfish farmers could be provided support to uptake kelp farming, and seaweed could be produced in an agroecological way through integrated multi-trophic aquaculture of kelp, mussels, and oysters to diversify production, filter the pollutants, and reduce the spread of disease. To complete this project, we extend, in the coming weeks, we will be developing a strategy for a just transition of the workers from the mining industry to the bio-based industries. Additionally, to extend the reach of our project and engage with the communities who could participate in the proposal, we are currently building a physical model to be displayed at the BGS.
And to conclude, our proposal calls on diverse participants to mobilize the bio-based industry, and it relies heavily on the designer's roles as a facilitator. So we encourage you to question within your own project, how can you expand your capacity as a designer to question where materials are produced, by whom, and the ownership structures that exist within material supply chains. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just keep one. It's well articulated, your argument, and I think the basic premise is you can start to encourage a new kind of material production. It is a very well-founded argument. I think that the shoreline zone is not, it's the highest energetic zone. Yeah. So, because there's always a great deal of turbulence, and the physics of that is something that could be incorporated into what you're doing. So, kelp, for example, can cope very well with enormous fast currents once it's established, but it's very hard to get established in a fast current. Mm-hmm. So the two ends of the project, I think, would be great to investigate. At the initial point of your initiation, can you incorporate some of that, both tidal energy and the circular energy, mechanical energy when waves hit the shore. And I think that depth, critical depth, is about 10 meters. So from 10 meters inwards, and that's moving backwards and forwards all the time. So it's kind of spatially dynamic as well, and seasonally dynamic, monthly, and so forth. So there's a whole set of parameters around the energy of the shoreline that you might find interesting. And the other end of it is the potential uses. So kelp, for example, long used as fertilizer, but in some countries, I think in rural Ireland, in ancient history, was actually, human food has to be treated in certain ways to do that, so it can enter into the human food chain, not just as animal fodder. You did talk about, I think, mussel shell or oyster shell rendering initially. But the use of those shells, if you are mussel farming, there must be other things you can do than grind them up and stick them on stuff. So that might be an interesting area to explore. But, yeah, interesting.
Thank you. An engaging project. I guess I kind of want you to be more radical. I know it feels like a radical project. The questions that I have really are about land ownership. How to position your project in a place where the land is, garbage tips. Because one of the problems with the commons is that, the Queen owns, 80-90% of everything. And then it's oligarchs, people that were rewarded with land for having slaves. And, so that the actual land and the idea of the commons, I was a professor at Newcastle. I think that's the only commons that still exists within a city that is still protected. So the idea of the commons and how people use it, I think, is an incredibly interesting, politically charged space. I think it needs to be reinvented for the 21st century. So, for example, someone like Steve Graham starts talking about vertical. So he's a geographer that is kind of looking at the vertical dimension, because if we just deal with a horizontal dimension, that's already populated. But how can you bring this kind of under the radar of capitalism? Because the second this community starts to create something nice and productive, as Ceres would say, it will attract parasites. So it will always already be consumed within the industrial machine. So how do you keep something like this from just being yet another soft target for exploitation? For me, that would be a very radical and kind of interesting move that might help you design the spaces, choose the materials. The things that I also kind of wanted to raise was, if you are going to do seaweeds, are these natives? Are they monocultures? Are they, are you also biodiversifying things? I kind of want you to be punk in terms of your proposition about this cultivating commons, because I think it needs to be a radical cultivation and a radical commons, ones that really can, it might be a Trojan horse, it might look like it is, it is a nice little patch of productivity through which some, landed wealthy owner kind of tolerates. But is there something else that's happening underneath it that allows, kind of a repositioning of the space and the power relationships within it? And the same, I think, I would say with the shellfish as well, not just the biodiversity, but you've also got the issues of climate change and, kind of sea changes, ocean acidification. Are you looking for mutants? I kind of, how might you help sow the seeds of a revolution from this, and not just, let's say, get a grant from UKRI, which would be good. Anyway, yeah. So I think it's great. I think you've got some seeds there. I want to see the politics of this totally blown out.
About what?
About this, so I think it's just the nature of the presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we are, another part of the study, like the project, is developing a procurement strategy which mandates the uses of these materials. So it's like looking at a REBA framework where it, for example, France is already doing, where they have to procure 30% of bio-based materials in every construction project. And if we mandate the agroecological practices within these policies itself, that would ensure that these materials that are being produced, harvested, are done in an ecologically sensitive manner, and it has to start from some mandating policies, I believe.
Just looking at the longer term of climate change, there's two scenarios for what will happen to near British waters. One is that they will continue to warm, so the traditional biological stocks are rapidly changing. And another is in about arguably somewhere between 30 and 80 years is this continued slowdown of the AMOC, which will mean a 3 or 4 degree temperature drop on the coast. Both of which will make a radical, either direction will make a radical change of what can live there at the microbial level, and that affects hierarchically everything else. So somewhere in the investigation are these longer term scenarios. Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.